Generations had passed since the Hebrews had been in Egypt. Many pharaohs came and went, and they saw the Hebrews grow in number and wealth. But the current pharaoh began to fear them. So he had them enslaved and even attempted to kill all newborn Hebrew boys. But Moses survived rather miraculously in a basket floated down the Nile River and grew up in the royal court cared for by no less than Pharaoh's daughter. From that palace of privilege, Moses saw his people oppressed and marginalized. He retaliated by murdering an Egyptian slave driver. Fearing retaliation, he fled to the land of Midian, which would be in present-day Saudi Arabia. There, he gets married, has a family, and gains some wealth. Then Moses encounters a burning bush that doesn't consume itself. Not only does he hear the voice of God, but Moses learns that God has heard the voice of his and cry of his people. God tells Moses to go free his people. But Moses, understandably, is reluctant and has 5 skeptical responses. First, Moses asks, "Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" God says, "Don't worry. I will be with you." The second response is the one from our reading earlier. Moses determines that the Israelites will probably ask, "What is the name of this deity that has sent you?" And God replies, "I am who I am." Or another way to translate that would be, "I will be who I will be." See, the divine name used here is a play on the Hebrew verb to be. Almost all English versions translate this name as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord. The Hebrew word transliterated to English is YHWH. No vowels were indicated in Hebrew at this time, so there is some debate on how to pronounce that name, but most conclude it is Yahweh. The third skeptical response from Moses was, "What if people don't believe that you have sent me?" God then shows him 3 signs that will prove God is indeed with Moses. The 4th time, Moses says, "But I can't speak very well. I am slow of speech." God says, "I will be with your mouth and teach you what to speak." And then the 5th time, Moses says, "Can you please just send someone else?" God says, "I will send your brother Aaron with you, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth." Now, eventually Moses and Aaron do indeed ask the Pharaoh to let their people go, and through a lot of struggle and miracles and plagues, Israel is freed. And 4 out of 5 times, God replies to Moses' reluctance with, "I will be with you" statements. But that second one, the one that was our reading, I want to spend a little bit more time on that. Theologians, you see, have spilled a lot of ink on this particular passage. Some inferred from it that God is not future or the past, God always is, and that God is outside of time and unchangeable truth, and therefore not dependent on anything. God's being is different from any and all other being. In fact, liberal theologians like Paul Tillich have gone even further. God is, in fact, not a being at all, but being itself, or the ground of being. In the words of the Reverend Max Kutz from a sermon preached here in the 1980s, he said, "God is existence." Is God inside or outside the container of being? Or like Reverend Coots said, is God identical with being? These are really interesting questions to ponder, but I doubt the writers of Exodus were trying to get into this abstract philosophical, theological stuff. There is a simpler sort of reading of this passage about the divine name, Yahweh. I am who I am, or I am who I will be. That is, Yahweh is always being present. The divine name, I will be what I am, in that context means I will be a faithful presence with you always, accompanying us on the journey to freedom. This divine presence leads us into new, unexplored possibilities. To me, that is what Passover is all about, a liberatory presence that always is. Now, Jesus also sensed this Passover presence. After all, he had a Passover Seder, aka the Last Supper with his disciples in the days preceding his death. Jesus, the real person, flesh and blood, knew the promised land of Israel was not some symbol of a far-off eternity or afterlife. Israel was a very real existential threat in that moment. He wanted his holy homeland back. He opposed the ruthless colonization of the Romans and the Jewish elite who had brokered power with them. Jesus wanted his people free, like a new Moses. We don't know how Jesus thought of himself, his self-identification, but we know that the early Christian church and the writers of the Gospels thought of him as just that, a new liberatory leader. The fact that Jesus came to Jerusalem on Passover week is not a mistake. He knew the stories and the traditions of Moses and felt a Passover presence of liberation and wanted to reclaim the promised land for his people. The ruling empire, through capital punishment and state-sanctioned violence, tried but could not fully stop the movement of spiritual and political freedom. Just like a police officer can kill George Floyd but cannot murder his memory. And so today, this Holy Week, on this 8th day of Passover, we yearn for an internal freedom, a freedom also for our people that is pulled on by a reassuring presence. In our lives, we need this pull of the Passover. It is a subtle presence we all have. A Passover presence disrupts us from the slumber of comfort and wealth of being in a distant land and encourages us to care about Myanmar's fight for freedom. A Passover presence reminds us of all who are incarcerated in the North Country and in the larger country. Many who are in solitary confinement, of the many who are imprisoned by our very own stifling thoughts. A Passover presence reminds us that freedom is springing. Passover has always been a spring festival of new life, a time of new plantings and new beginnings. And Easter picks right up on that theme. We might be tired right now of the struggle, the boredom of the pandemic, and sick of wearing masks, and the losses that we are experiencing can hit us hard. So we need lilies, flowers that resurrect our spirits. A Passover presence is always with us, nudging us into more liberation, changing us and keeping our circle whole. Divinity is coaxing us and arising in us like the daffodils. It's saying to us, we can clean up our lives. We can have gratitude. We can get past the grief. Disrupted pandemic lives need this springing of freedom. The stories of both Moses and Jesus are just that, stories. But oh, such budding stories worthy of retelling every year. Now, how much of these stories are actual verifiable history? That's up for debate. Yet Moses was able to lead his people, and Jesus, despite his death, was able to live again in his followers. These old stories speak new truths. The daffodils have risen out of the ashes of snow. They have resurrected out of the decay. They have pierced through last year's leaves and have risen triumphant. Now, ever since I can remember, the daffodils have become symbols of spring and Easter. They seem to bloom right when they should each year, and the deer never eat them. I just recently learned, though, in a New York Times article that daffodils are not at all native plants to North America. In fact, many of the flowers we associate with spring are not native. My heart dropped a bit, but the daffodils still speak to us. And similarly, the Easter and Passover stories surely are not natural facts, but still speak to us today. Because spring is a long season. I'm not sure where it starts or ends. And it is why we need these stories told every year. The daffodils defeat the ice year after year. Moses' liberation movement was not defeated by the powerful Pharaoh. Jesus' freedom movement was not ultimately defeated by the Roman Empire. The power of state-sanctioned violence will not have a final say on things. A Passover presence guides the afflicted with miracles of wonder and stories of hope. The stories and the flowers are true when we recognize the presence in them. A Passover presence transforms us like the lily in the window. Old stories and timeless metaphors of new life help us rise up out of our wintry dormancy and into an emerging movement of new life. That bulbs rise again and again in the April sun, despite the snowy decay of life, is that not a miracle? A sign to us that the powerful destructive forces in life can be overcome. May the renewing power of a Passover presence guide our lives into the liberatory land of promise. Amen, and blessed be.